All right, so let's talk Titanic. The boat cost $10 million to make in 1912. The movie cost $200 million to make in 1997. CPI in 1997 was 160. Since it's 317 now and it was 160 then, basically prices have doubled in the last 28 years, which again historically is really good. So what did the boat cost if we adjusted for inflation? Well, 10 million times 160 divided by 9.9 is 161 million dollars. So if we believe the consumer price index, it cost more to make the movie than it did to build the boat. All right, we can do the same thing with movies. Here's the problem with movies. I don't know if you've ever been to the movies, but if you go to the movies, I don't know what you guys do when you're out on dates nowadays, but if you go to the movies, which is the date thing, it costs a lot of money. My dad talks about the fact that his mom, who was used to have her girlfriends over to play poker in the afternoon, used to kick him out of the house and give him a quarter. With the quarter, he could go to the movies, see 2 movies, not just one, and eat. Let me say that again. With a quarter, he could see 2 movies and eat, and not bug his mom while she was home playing poker. So, nowadays, a movie costs like $50 to get in, and then your date gets another $50, and there's $200 in popcorn, and life is just not the way it should be. So if we look at what we call nominal movie revenue, nominal means how much money did we actually pay? Avatar, Avengers Endgame, the second Avatar, Titanic, Star Wars, The Force Awakens, Infinity War, Spider-Man No Way Home, which I hated. I didn't really hate the whole thing, but I hate the ending. Inside Out 2 compared to 1, Jurassic World, which is not nearly as good as Jurassic Park, and the new Lion King, which sucks compared to the old original Lion King, right? It's just like there's a new Mulan and there's no little dragon in it, right? We need the dragon guy. Anyway, we can adjust for inflation. If we adjust for inflation, the number 1 movie of all time is Gone with the Wind. So nowadays you can say, well, I don't need to go see The Way of the Water because I can just wait till it comes out on video. Well, when Gone with the Wind came out to video, if you had said that, I'll just wait till it comes out on video, you'd have been waiting 70 years. So people went and saw it over and over and over again. Okay? People saw that movie over and over and over again. Star Wars. I was in college when Star Wars came out, the original Star Wars, the one that's original number 1 but now called number 4. I have friends that went to see it 7 times. I went to see it a couple times just because they dragged me along. It's not I like Star Wars, but Empire is a much better than the first one. The Sound of Music, E.T., Titanic is still there, 10 Commandments, Charlton Heston, Let My People Go. Jaws. Dr. Zhivago, which you probably have never even heard of, much less seen. The Exorcist with Linda Blair, and the Disney cartoon Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. And then if we get down a little further in the real movie revenue, there's a bunch of old James Bond movies, the good ones. Thunderball, Goldfinger, stuff like that. So what are the most popular, most seen movies in the theater are Gone with the Wind and Star Wars and The Sound of Music, not Avatar and Endgame. They just had higher ticket prices. So we can adjust movies so that we get, and the real Lion King, the cartoon Lion King is in the top 20. The Lion King, the new Lion King isn't anywhere close to being in the top 20 if we adjusted for ticket prices. Okay? So, what are the problems with inflation? Well, the biggest thing is it creates uncertainty. If you don't know what the price of something's going to be next year, that changes your whole decision process, right? A lot of times you think, well, I'll just wait and see if I can get it on sale or whatever, blah, blah, blah. If you think the prices are just going to go up, that changes your buying behavior, and that's not a good thing. Businesses and uncertainty means businesses are going to invest less. It means consumers are going to save less, because what does inflation do to your savings? If you have $100 in the bank, every time prices go up, that $100 is worth less and less and less and less. Okay? So economists think that inflation long-term for the economy is a worse thing than unemployment because it creates uncertainty and it stops investment and it stops savings. All right, some types of inflation. Type number 1, demand pull inflation. And the next group of videos we have is on aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and you'll see these things. Demand pull inflation means prices are going to go up because we want to buy stuff. We spent all this time locked down during the pandemic. There was a 1.5 to 2 years where people didn't go on vacation. They didn't buy stuff. And then what happens? So they're actually saving a whole bunch of money. What happens when the pandemic ends and they're free? They go on vacations. They buy all kinds of stuff. They go crazy. Well, the businesses out there all took advantage of it and raised prices. So maybe a third of all the inflation we've had in the last 4 or 5 years is because consumers are buying stuff more and businesses took advantage of it by jacking up a bunch of prices. Okay? Demand pull inflation. Number 2 is cost push. Here's what happens. Costs go up. That makes prices go up, right? I'm a business person. I have to pay more for my stuff. I charge you more for it. Then the workers go, hey, prices have gone up. I need a raise. So workers get a raise. That means costs went up, which means prices go up, which means wages go up, which means prices. You with me? It's called a wage price spiral. Excuse me. And what did we see during the pandemic? Well, we saw supply chains were disrupted. Businesses had trouble getting certain products because there weren't enough trucks and there weren't enough ships and there weren't enough airplanes and they were having trouble. So what does that trouble do? They raised their prices. And then on top of that, we had tariffs. The tariffs meant prices of things like steel went up. Prices of things that, if you think that a 20% tariff changes the difference in price between steel that's made in Brazil and steel that's made in the United States, you're crazy, right? A 20% tariff is not going to stop people from buying Brazilian steel. It's just going to make the price of everything go up, right? There are steel producers all over the world that produce so much cheaper than we do here in the United States because, again, wage rates in much of the world are way lower than they are here. So the tariffs had created significant inflation in the United States. So you had a third of the inflation due to people's buying behavior. You had a third of the inflation due to supply chains, tariffs, all of the cost stuff. And then, here's some examples. I'll be back in a second. But 2020 CPI, PPI. So what happened in 2020? Food went up 4%, sugar was up 9%, peanut butter was up 11%. You could see in 2020 prices started going up. But gasoline went down. Why? Nobody's driving. If nobody's driving, the price of gas is going to go down, right? Basic supply and demand. The price of appliances went up 16% because we had tariffs on steel, and every appliance has a bunch of steel in it. Overall, 1.4. So people could say, look, inflation was really low in 2020. Except, again, you had things that were going way up and things that were going way down. So on average, there was no inflation. But, yeah, there was clear inflation in some categories in 2020. And then the white part is businesses. So the feed farmers were buying for their cows and their sheep and their chickens went up 13%. What does that mean? They're going to have to pass that along to us, the consumer. Airfares went way down because people weren't traveling. Unprocessed materials, raw ore, iron ore, all that kind of stuff, up 20%. Steel up 41%. Automobiles, unassembled kind of the partway through the process, up 45%. Overall 1% because things are going up and down, but you could see in the PPI that inflation was there and it was going to hit us hard. Okay? So we know the thing about the PPI is it tells us what's going to happen to the CPI. When you see those numbers in the PPI in 2020, you know inflation was coming. Okay? There's no way it wasn't coming. So what's the last third of inflation? Well, the last third of inflation is monetary inflation. So Donald Trump printed $3 trillion to pay for tax cuts and the CARES Act while he was president. Joe Biden comes in and prints another $1.6 trillion. All of that money, and we'll talk about this more in detail as we go through the semester, but all of that money is going to put upward pressure on prices because there's more money in the system, but there's not more stuff for it to buy. So we had a really unusual inflation in that it had demand pull in it, it had cost push in it, and it had pure monetary inflation in it. You can't blame, well, if you want to blame somebody, you got to blame lots of people, and you got to blame the virus, and you got to blame big corporations who can take advantage of their customers, right? It's complicated. We also have built into this something called a misery index. So the misery index is the sum of inflation and unemployment. Okay? So Obama's last 3 years, Trump's first 3 years, the misery index was 6 to 7-ish. Today, it's actually 8 or 9. 12 was where it was during the worst time under Biden was 12, and now it's actually down to 8-ish, 8, 9. When Jimmy Carter was president, it was 22. When Richard Nixon left office, it was around 20. It tells you how bad things are in the economy, is this misery index. 6 to 7 is really good. The 8 to 9 we have is pretty good. The 12 we had during the Great Recession is obviously way worse than 6, but not nearly as bad as 22. So let's talk about interest rates here briefly. Interest rates are the price of money. Okay? Why do banks charge higher or lower interest rates? They charge the interest rate they need to make a profit. So if banks can get money cheap, low interest rates can be low. If banks have trouble getting money to loan out, interest rates will be high. Okay? Just like any other price, supply and demand for money is going to determine what interest rates are. Okay? So the Federal Reserve controls the supply of money. The banking system has a lot to say about the demand for money. Those two things together. There was congressman today complaining, or not today, but, recently the chair of the Federal Reserve was at Congress, and Congress people were complaining that long-term interest rates are too high. That's supply and demand, right? Interest rates would be going down. If people thought that the future was better than the present, long-term interest rates would go down. The fact that long-term interest rates are going up means that people think the future is going to be worse than the present, right? It's a sign to us. So, here we go. Bank makes me a loan, $200,000 to buy a house. So I go out and buy a house for $200,000. All right? If my home value rises 5% a year, what's it going to be worth in 10 years? Well, the answer is it's going to be $362,000. You don't have to worry about the math, but it's going to be worth about $362,000. How much do I have to pay the bank? Oh yeah, I borrowed $200,000 from the bank. Well, the bank's not stupid. What's the bank going to do when they loan me the $200,000? They're going to make me pay enough interest so that I pay them back more than not the $200,000, but more than the $362,000. Okay? You can easily end up paying $600,000 to pay back your $200,000. Okay? All right. So the bank has two choices. It can charge high enough interest, which would be something above 5%, or it can structure the loan, or both. And what, in fact, the banks do is they structure the loan. So if you go out and buy a house, all you're going to do the first 5 years is pay interest. They're going to front load the interest payments. So if you take a $200,000 loan out and you're paying, let's say, $1,500 a month to pay back that $200,000 loan, that means you're paying $1,500, 12 months, right? Yes? So how much do you pay a year? Okay. Yeah. So you're paying $18,000 a year to the bank. In those first 5 years, you're going to pay that bank almost $100,000. And you're going to find you paid your mortgage down by $2,000. And the bank's taking $90-something thousand in interest off of you. Okay? Because the bank's counting on you selling that house. The bank's counting on you selling that house before you get anywhere close to paying it off. Okay? And that's how the inflation hurts the bank. It helps the person who buys the house and takes out the loan, but it hurts the bank. And so the bank is going to make adjustments because of that. All right? So again, my house is worth $362. What's the bank doing to me? They're going to screw with me. We call this, the whole thing, the real interest rate. Real means you thought, because all those rappers are out there talking about real, keeping it real, and you didn't know what that meant. Keeping it real means adjusting for inflation. Okay? So what interest rate do I pay? Well, I'm going to pay a real interest rate. I'm going to pay enough money so the bank gets its money back. So maybe that's 3-4, right? Adjusted for inflation. Then we're going to add inflation on top of that, and we're also going to add some risk in there. So the riskier you are, if there's a risk that you're not going to pay your loan back, the bank's going to charge you a higher interest rate. Okay? So I'll give you a cheesy Vegas example. The Mirage, which is being torn down now, and across the street from the Mirage is, I call it the Sands, but it's not really the Sands. Anyway, so Mirage builds a hotel. Las Vegas Sands builds a hotel. Okay? Mirage got a lower interest rate. Why? Because they thought that Steve Wynn, who built the Mirage, had a better chance of paying his loan back. The less likely you are to pay your loan back, the higher the interest rate. So government bonds have really low interest rates because the government can always pay its loan back. It might pay you back with worthless dollars, but it can always pay the loan back. Okay? If you go to the bank and get a loan, they're going to charge you more because there's a chance you're going to go bust. Okay? If you go to a payday loan place, I don't know if you watch the ads for payday loans, but they'll say, hey, borrow $200 from us. We'll only charge you $9 a week. Well, how many weeks are there in a year? 52? 52 times 9 is $468. So you're paying $468 for a year of a $200 loan. That's 230% interest you're paying. We get that? That payday loan place is charging you more than 200% interest. And some of these rent-to-own places where they go, hey, come on down, rent-to-own. And they advertise all over NASCAR, which tells you something about the people who watch NASCAR. Rent-to-own. Rent-to-own is usually like 400% interest on what you, yeah. And then, of course, there's the loan shark where if you don't pay it back, they break stuff like bones. But the riskier you are, the higher the interest rate you're going to pay. Okay? We calculate the real interest rate by taking the money interest rate, the nominal interest rate, subtract inflation. So if you got a 4% mortgage and inflation is 7%, like we had a few years ago, really you're paying a minus interest rate. The bank is paying you for that loan, and you're in really good shape, right? So if you had a home mortgage during the time that inflation was high and your income went up, and you were doing pretty well, right? It may not seem like it, but in a lot of ways, you were doing pretty darn well. All right. So, what are the costs of inflation? We already said this. Did we already say this? We